Hello and welcome to the first edition of a new series of video blogs called Staying Onside, where one of our specialist sports teams takes a look at some of the biggest legal and business issues in the world of sport. This week we'll be taking a look at player power, and in particular, why don't clubs sack players who go on strike? In this year's January transfer window, we have seen the usual reports of players looking to engineer a move from their club, with several players allegedly downing tools. Dimitri Payet reportedly told West Ham he would never play for the club again if his move to Marseille was not granted. Meanwhile, out-of-favour Leicester City striker Leonardo Ulloa tweeted to say, "I feel betrayed by Ranieri and let down by the club. I will not play for them again." Indeed, collective player power has been cited as one of the key reasons why Leicester City's owners decided to sack Claudio Ranieri, only months after he lifted the Premier League trophy. Many fans will recognise the feeling of injustice when a star player turns his back on the club, but most of the time the player does seem to get their way, be it a transfer or a lucrative new contract. These situations can drive a wedge between the fans and the owners, who often seem to pander to the player's wishes. It doesn't seem right. Why should a Premier League footballer on a huge salary be allowed to go on strike and get away with it? After all, if me and you simply stopped turning up for work, we wouldn't get a pay rise, we'd probably get our P45. Let's take a closer look at the rules. In England, footballers are employees of their clubs. Their playing contract set out the length of the contract, their salary plus any bonus, and will also contain obligations on the player to play and train to the best of their ability. The players and clubs will also be bound by employment legislation in the UK, such as the rules around unfair dismissal, and the football-specific regulations contained in FIFA's regulations on the status and transfer of players, the FA regulations, the Premier League rules, and finally the Football League's rules. This web of rules and regulations collectively governs the transfer market. When a player falls out with his club, the parties will seek to use the full extent of these rules to protect their economic and sporting interests. So if a player refuses to play, what practical options does the club have? Well, the first option is to sack the player. When a player goes on strike, he is in breach of his playing contract by refusing to do the very thing he is paid to do, play football. Just like anybody else who doesn't show up for work, the club has a right to sack the player and terminate the contract. The club can also apply to the FIFA Dispute Resolution Chamber for compensation from the player. Sound good? Well, not really. There are three major problems with the club sacking their player. Number one, applying for compensation takes a long time. No one really knows how much compensation FIFA will decide to award. Number two, whilst the club is applying for compensation, the player is free to play for anybody else. If you're Manchester United, that could mean Man City. If you're Arsenal, that could mean Spurs. Unlike in a transfer, the club has absolutely no control over the player's new club, which could have a big impact on that club's season. And number three, even if compensation is eventually awarded, enforcing payment can be fraught with difficulty. Just ask Chelsea about the problems it had enforcing a FIFA decision against Mutu. Option 2 is to punish the player. The club could choose not to use its legal right to sack the player and instead choose to make an example of him. The player will be left to rot in the reserves or train with the youth team. If it's a World Cup or major tournament year, the club might even be able to screw up that player's chances of playing for the national team. On the other hand, whilst the player gathers dust, he stays on the wage books, and as the remaining time on his contract runs out, his transfer value will inevitably go down. Economically, it's a tough pill to swallow, so many clubs choose option 3. Either seek to rebuild the relationship with the player, perhaps by offering him a new deal, or sell the player in the next transfer window. Unlike in a dispute, the club has control over the destination club and the amount of cash it receives in the form of the transfer fee. The club also achieves a clean break with a player who might have been having a negative impact on the dressing room and on team morale. So we can see that historically, star players throwing a tantrum or handing in a transfer request give clubs and managers a big headache. Do you force a demotivated footballer to play against his will? Do you stick him in the reserves and watch as a key player's value drops? Or do you just bite the bullet and sell up? To the fury of the fanbase, of course. However, in the Premier League at least, the increased financial power of smaller clubs means that they are better equipped than ever to withstand a major sulk and keep hold of their best players. Whether such grandstanding can ultimately improve competitive balance in the Premier League, or merely gives clubs a renewed ability to cut off their nose to spite their face, well, that remains to be seen. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Staying Onside. Onside Law is a commercial law firm specialising in the sport, fashion and media sectors. You can find us on our website at www.onsidelaw.co.uk, or on LinkedIn, or on our Twitter @OnsideLaw.